It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our surprise guest, our wonderful guest that we have here. He is one of the leading foreign policy commentators and analysts in the United States, was a senior official in the Clinton administration, serving both as Deputy Undersecretary and as Acting Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. He was the editor-in-chief and CEO of Foreign Policy magazine. He is the author of hundreds of articles and tens of books, including the definitive histories of how the US national security process works. Currently, he is a foreign policy and political affairs columnist for USA Today and the Daily Beast, and is a regular television commentator, having appeared this week on MSNBC every day to offer insight into the Ukraine crisis. He's also CEO of a media company that produces podcasts on international and political themes. His popular podcast, Deep State Radio, has been downloaded 10 million times. Also, there's a cultural diplomacy twist. He got his start as a theater director and is the creator and producer of a television show that has won multiple Emmys. He is also the CEO of a media company that produces podcasts on international political themes. I will say he is so great, as you can read here, that I married him. So I'm very delighted to introduce you to my husband, David Rothkopf. Let's please unmute and give David a round of applause. David, are you with us?
I'm with you.
There you are. Hello. Thank you for making the time to join us and share your valuable insight on, our passion for issues of culture and public diplomacy at a time when there's such a critical conflict going on. I wonder if we could just really start by addressing this. How do you see issues of public and cultural diplomacy to have the ability, let's say, to connect with a conflict like that is happening in the Ukraine? This is something that I've heard you say is the first war of the social media era. Can you tell us a little bit about what that phrase means and how this connects to public and cultural diplomacy? Thank you.
Well, I think it connects to public and cultural diplomacy in a fundamental way, because I think public and cultural diplomacy is changing. And I know you study it here, and I know you study how it's been done. And I think you're kind of studying the buggy whip age of cultural diplomacy, because it's taking place now on the internet. It's taking place now via medium in which literally every individual on the planet Earth has the ability to reach out and touch every other individual on the planet Earth. And so the primary flows of communication between countries are social media flows, they're internet flows, they're not government to government flows. Once upon a time, the government wanted to influence another people, their diplomats would speak, or they would arrange special guests from one country to visit the other country. That's happened for a long, long time. But what's happening in this era is that most of the communication is far outside the control of the government, can only barely be influenced by them. And I think you see that notably in the case of this conflict. I suspect most of the people who are on this session have been following the Ukraine conflict on Twitter or on Facebook or on some other social media platform. And as a consequence, they're not even getting most of the stories from mainstream media. They're getting it from people in the street. Every single individual inside Ukraine right now has a camera that's a better quality video camera than television studios, professional television studios had 20 years ago. And so as a consequence, they're able to record atrocities. They're able to tell stories. And, yesterday, on the first day of this conflict, you had two of these things go viral that illustrate one of the critical issues associated with cultural diplomacy that draws itself from the origins of culture, and that is storytelling. At the end of the day, if you have a protagonist and an interesting story, it moves people. It doesn't just affect people. You read off a State Department statement about Ukraine. It was all accurate. I'm sure it was the position of the United States government, but government talking points don't move people. But if you watched the video image yesterday of a little old lady in Ukraine go up to a Russian soldier who told her to go away, and then she said, "You're in my country. You should leave." And he said, "No, go away. I'm here." And she said, "Well, here, let me give you this sunflower seed." And she said, "Put it in your pocket, because when you're dead, at least it will grow into a sunflower. Now get out of my country." And it was like, holy moly. And of course, that went viral. Or you had the case of Snake Island, small little island off the coast of Ukraine. Russian military vessel approaches it and announces to the 13 Ukrainian military people who are on the island, "We're a Russian military vessel, get off the island and put down your weapons." And the 13 people who are on the island talked among themselves. You could hear it in the audio. And one of them said to the other, "Should I tell him to go fuck himself?" And the other person said, "Yeah, do that." And so he, he announced from the island, "Fuck you." And then they were all killed. The Russians killed them all. But there is a story, there's a legend, there's a legend now of these 13 people on Snake Island. And all that you could do if you're Vladimir Putin and you're lying, you're issuing press releases, you're saying the Ukrainians are doing, bad things, nobody's buying that. But these stories are touching people. And I think there's a lesson there for governments. The lesson is the political mood of the modern era is being shifted by other means than it has been in the past. And while you can't control those means, you need to recognize them. And I think Russia, to conclude the answer to your question, is at a big disadvantage right now, because they are a closed society. They rely on censorship. They rely on silencing dissent. Ukraine is an open society. So everybody in Ukraine, for as long as they have the chance, is going to be telling their stories. And we, those are just two of the first day of this, and there are others. And that's going to motivate people. It's going to mobilize people. It's going to remind people of the human reasons for fighting for their country. And it's going to make them much harder to defeat.
Well, thank you for sharing both of those stories with us, David. I think, I have seen firsthand more and more how digital diplomacy is starting to play such an important role in sharing those stories and really in tying to public diplomacy, this idea that any citizen can be an actor and share a story and share a message. I'm wondering, when we look at the sort of top of the pyramid and that weighted word of diplomacy now, how do you see diplomacy changing in this new information era? I mean, you're definitely talking to us about the social media component and the storytelling. What advice would you have for us here in the group who really care as citizens? And many of us work for governments and public affairs and so forth. What could we do to play an active role, let's say, whether it's in a crisis like the one that's happening or moving forward, in sharing our stories and in helping redefine diplomacy?
Well, first of all, let me say there are core types of diplomacy that are going to always continue to be government to government and high level, right? And I give a lot of credit to the Biden administration at the moment for re-emphasizing those things, because in the past, I think the role of the U.S. State Department and other diplomatic organizations around the world has been minimized a little bit, or has taken a back seat to security organizations or other kinds. But in this administration under Secretary Blinken, there's been an effort to emphasize alliances, re-emphasize international institutions. The last administration sought essentially to discard those things, which the US has spent 80 years or so trying to build up, and our allies have spent 80 years or trying to build up. And this administration said, no, that's important. And to be a good ally, you have to listen. You know, Secretary Blinken gave a speech in early March in which he talked about humility as a vital component of diplomacy. And it's probably the most forgotten, most underestimated. But as my dad once said, the way to make everybody think you're a genius is to listen to them, right? And it's true for a diplomat as well. You've got to listen, you've got to hear. And one of the results of reemphasizing that, of course, is that you have the Atlantic Alliance stronger than ever, working together in a more unified way. That's an extremely positive thing. So I don't want to say diplomacy in its traditional form is unimportant. It's important. But the area that you're looking at, public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, used to be something that you could manage or influence with a press release, or even Radio Free Europe was the public diplomacy side of it, where the US would go and try and build radio stations and broadcast out into the closed world of the Soviet Empire. And in cultural diplomacy, it was like, let's send a group of people over, they'll listen to our songs, they'll hear our stories, that'll influence them in some way. But of course, today, if you send a bunch of jazz musicians to Eastern Europe and you didn't have people in the crowd tweeting it out, if you didn't have a TikTok of it, if you didn't put it out there on social media, it doesn't exist. And so you have to recognize that you've got to go out and use those tools. But of course, social media doesn't want to hear anything about press releases. Social media doesn't want to hear anything about, the State Department spokesman said blah, 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 blah. Social media wants virality, right? They want stories that drive virality. And virality is about connecting to people, about telling the stories, about being urgent, about being shareable, about, it's about a whole bunch of other kinds of things. And so if you want to influence global opinion, then you have to work in the language and with the technology here. And governments are pretty bad at it. Governments are pretty bad at it. And I think that means you need public-private partnerships to go out and work with groups that are better at it. Now, having said that, and you and I have talked about this a lot, that some governments understand cultural diplomacy in this era in a different way. And you talk sometimes, and I've known your group has talked about, for example, the government of Korea, South Korea, that has gone out and they said, no, we want to have a bigger impact on the world. And they didn't say, well, so let's put out 1,000 more press releases, because 1,000 more, or let's send government officials around. That wasn't going to do it. How do you impact the world? You impact the world through K-pop. You impact the world through having a major film industry, and China, it's not an accident that something like TikTok comes out of China. It's not an accident that the Chinese have, a fairly closed society, have had this aggressive development of social media within their society. Now they regulate it. They try to suppress some of it, but it is a society that is, extremely adept at using these kind of tools. And it's interesting to me. I follow a lot of people on like Twitter, and Chinese television is pretty good at Twitter. And so they, now some of it's kind of dumb, and they'll go and they'll do, a little video about, a cat in a tree in some place.
Okay. I've got to stop you there because I'm a fan of those cat videos, David.
Yeah,
You know
well, I
that.
understand. I understand. And they know that cat videos work. I think there's a role for cat videos in public in cultural diplomacy today. But the point is, some of it is quite effective, and they built a lot of it around the Belt and Road Initiative, which is their big cultural diplomacy initiative. And you need tools to do that. And you've got a little outfit in the State Department that does digital diplomacy. I think it's got 80 people in it. But it's kind of a backwater. It's not really doing, it's still sort of at the children's table. If you really cared about this stuff, every part of your agency would have the ability to go and disseminate things socially, and they would do it. They would do it.
Well, I'm really encouraged to hear you say this, David, because last week, as you know, we had Richard Stengel, and he was also just talking in this line of sort of the power of public diplomacy, even brought up an artist like Taylor Swift and the influence that she would yield, or some pop culture icons. You've mentioned also the role of cultural diplomacy with South Korea, and of course, things like the Squid Games come to mind, or Parasite, and that's no accident, as you said. That was something that really was an emphasis, as I understand it. And group will be looking at a couple cases on K-pop and really the investment and the support that was given by both the private sector and government in sort of promoting Korean culture. But along with that, we're touching now here on cultural diplomacy. We're touching on digital diplomacy. And I know there's so many other elements, culinary diplomacy. We've got someone in our group who I know is particularly interested in that. And all joking aside, but some of the comments here in the chat, soft purr for cats, I think there is a lightheartedness that at least does bring us back to that common humanity and fostering mutual understanding. So I want to ask you one more question, and just a reminder to the group before I ask this question, we will be opening it up to questions from the group at about 1:45. I know there's already some really good ones, so just start to think about that. And I'll also put in David's Twitter handle, because he's quite good on Twitter if any of you are interested in following him. But just given all of this, David, okay, so we're in a process of sort of redefining how important public and cultural diplomacy are in a time of crisis. Could you offer 2 or 3 or 5 just sort of steps or pointers for someone like the members of our group who wanted to get more engaged? I mean, one seems obvious, more engagement on social media, whether it's following or posting or reading, but sort of this idea of the currency of social media and becoming active in that way. Does anything else come to mind as we start to sort of redefine public diplomacy for really actionable steps that the group could take after this call? I think we're all feeling like we want to do something and we want to do more. And I'm thankful for that collective feeling. Obviously, this is a group that's very close to my heart here. What advice would you give us?
Well, I guess I have to answer that question because you're my wife, but I have to say I don't know that I would give advice to a group of 110 people, because everybody's advice would be different, right? I think if the goal is, or the question is, how do I use the tools available to me to build cultural connections, to break down cultural barriers, whether I'm working for a government or not working for a government? I think the advice I would give is the same as maybe instinctive to many people, and that is, use the tools available to you today. It used to be that the people who controlled the means of distribution of information or art forms were in charge. That meant if you owned a printing press, you controlled the public discourse in the society. If you owned a radio station license, if you owned a chain of movie theaters, you were in charge of what movies were made because you were the one who was presenting them, right? The means of distribution was the critical linchpin here. The means of distribution today is free. It's taken out. It was the high cost thing. It required a lot of capital. Every single person here who is listening to this has the ability to use the exact same tool like this, Zoom, and connect to anybody in the world or everybody in the world. And you can have a huge impact in doing so. An impact, like I'll give you an example, and it's a personal example, so I'm a little reluctant to give it, but it just illustrates the point. The other night I was ruminating, that it was sort of the night before this war started, about how disturbed I was that there were a group of people in a political party here who were taking shots at the United States position and embracing Putin's position and so forth. And this is just my view. Other people may have other views, but it bothered me. So I went on Twitter and I kind of, unloaded, in a Twitter thread. And I haven't checked in the past 24 hours, but as of at some point yesterday, that Twitter thread had 6 million impressions. It had been engaged with 500,000 times. It had had almost 100,000, retweets, and so it was. Now, I'm not bragging. What I'm saying is, there I was, sitting in bed with my laptop in the dark, tweeted out, 12 or 14 tweets in a thread, and reached 6 million people, which, I've written for every major publication in the world, never reached that many people. I was on MSNBC every night this week. If you look at the shows and get their total audience, it's not 6 million people. But, there was this tool that enabled me to do it. Now, everybody has the ability to do that. The question is, how do you do it? And that's where, I think one of the secret sauces of your discussions here is that it's not just about cultural diplomacy. How do you use music or theater or dance to connect societies? How do diplomats do it? How do you use it to achieve government goals? Those are all important things. I think one of the other interesting things is that you need to think like an artist more than you think like a diplomat. Because artists are about telling stories. They are about connecting with the other person. They're about thinking who the audience is. They're about, when I was a director, I always used to say, make the audience come to you. Not, sort of beating them over the head, but make them lean in and listen. They're about, again, in acting terms, the acting idea was always, you don't act, you react. You listen to the other person, you respond to the other person, you engage in a conversation. Most diplomacy, public diplomacy, has been one way. But in the modern era, none of it is one way. It's all interactive. It involves listening. It involves empathy. It involves those kind of exchanges. And to me, that's a big advantage here. I guess the punchline of all of this is, if you stay informed, if you stay on the news, if you understand what audiences are, and if you do one other thing, which is really hard to do, and that is you actually express your authentic self. Because one of the other things, and again, this is an arts thing, it's not a diplomacy thing. Diplomacy has historically been about not expressing your authentic self. It's been about hiding your authentic self. But in social media, if you fake it, if you lie, it flops because everybody can tell. And you all know it. You've all seen a politician stand up and say, hey, folks, I'd really like to connect to you. And now I'm going to read you a stump speech. And it doesn't have anything to do with you because they gave the stump speech in the last town they were in, or they give it every night, And you're like, that's inauthentic. They're not connecting with me. And I think that, it's this issue of connection of, on a human level that's really the secret here. And I got to tell you, if I went and I went, to the Council on Foreign Relations, or I went to an NSC meeting and I started talking about, things like connection, empathy, and so forth, I would be excused from the room. And this goes back to the point that I thought Richard Stengel, who I thought was brilliant last week, made. The government doesn't really know how to do this stuff very well. And so on a lot of big issues, it shouldn't be left to the government. It needs to be other kinds of movements that are going to produce changes. And we've seen it in the past 20 years. You've seen things like the landmine movement and other kinds of movements. They come up from individuals, and then they influence society. And I think we're moving into an era where a lot more of that's possible.
Mm. Well, you give us a lot of hope, David. And I know in your recent article for the Daily Beast also, there's a really fantastic analysis of the situation, and a hopeful one, optimistically hopeful, but still hopeful, which I'll share with everyone in the group as well. Before we open it up to questions on a sort of more practical level of the situation, is there anything that you would like to comment on regarding the foreign affairs that are taking place in the Ukraine? Any kind of a political analysis that you could offer us as we start to think about how public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy can move forward when it is the right time for the work that will undoubtedly need to be done. I'm not asking for a prediction here, but I think some of the analysis that you offered in that article was really valuable. Anything you could share about that?
Well, I'm happy to make a prediction, but I tell you, the thrust of the article was, I think this is the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin, and that's why a bunch of people thought it was optimistic. I have to say, I didn't think that was particularly optimistic, because I think a guy who's that powerful, as he declines, takes a lot of people down with him, and it's a very dangerous situation. But he has been able to pass himself through the world for 20 years, going to Davos and hobnobbing with people. And, every time he does something bad, a week later, he's invited to host the Olympics or host a soccer tournament, or, go on. And he's been able to get away with that. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. He has, violated sort of the cardinal rule of sort of modern international society. He's gone into a sovereign nation unprovoked, without any justification whatsoever. Hundreds of people are already dead. Society is broken, and the infrastructure of society has been attacked. And I just don't think he's going to recover from this in terms of his global standing. I think he's made some big miscalculations. I think first he went into Georgia, he wasn't punished. He went into Crimea, he wasn't punished. He thinks that's going to happen here. It's not going to happen here. He thought NATO was fractured and fragmented. It's not. It's actually come together. Finland and Sweden may join. NATO's going to come out of this stronger than it was. He thought that the US was too weak to respond. He'd been actively trying to promote that. But the US has actually been extremely effective as a leader here, very committed to diplomacy, as we talked about earlier, and has been quite successful. I think he thought that Ukraine would be a pushover, and that hasn't been the case. They've been fighting back. And, I just, I have to say, I worry about the short-term outcome, but not the longer term outcome. And that's because I think Russia has the military capacity to ultimately take Ukraine, go into Kyiv, depose the government, and impose their own government. And I think that's the goal. And I think they will try to do that. But having said that, what happens next? If he thinks he can put a lid on that society and turn it into another Belarus, it's just not going to happen, because this is an open society and they are going to fight back. And part of their fight back is going to be that they're going to be supported by the West in terms of an insurgency, whether it's in terms of weapons or money or whatever. But part of it is just the spirit of the people. And this is where what we're talking about is going to come in. They will communicate with each other. And I'm going to give you an analogy here, which may seem kind of crazy, although it links directly in my mind to the sunflower seed woman or the guys on Snake Island. In my view, nobody in the rest of the world knows who the last 5 US secretaries of state are. They think of the United States in terms of Hollywood, and Hollywood captured these moments better than anybody else. And so all the lists of the best movies that ever came out of Hollywood, close to the top, or at the top, is the movie Casablanca. And in the movie Casablanca, where Humphrey Bogart is, running this bar and so forth, you have this conflict between the Nazis and all these immigrants who are coming out of Europe, displaced by the Nazis. And in fact, one of the interesting things about that movie is those immigrants were actually played by people who were refugees from Europe. Almost all of them were. And there is this unbelievably emotional moment where the Nazis want to strike up a Nazi song, and a woman who was actually a French refugee sings the Marseillaise.
Mm.
Everybody sings along. Everybody is moved. The reason the movie is a classic, more than any other thing, more than Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman and Play It Again, Sam, is that moment. Because why? Because why? Because it connects with you as a human being. And the reason that the woman, a little old lady going up to a Russian soldier and saying, put this sunflower seed in your pocket, because when you're dead, it will grow into a sunflower, and in my ground, in the ground of my country. It's so like, holy crap, this is emotional. That's why Ukraine will win in the end. Putin does not have enough money, enough soldiers, enough power to keep a lid on a society that is allowed to maintain and share its emotional truth.
Mm. David, you've given us all a lot to think about, and I would say touched our hearts with that story, and with the reminder of the power of storytelling, of the arts, and the power of the human spirit. I want to open it up now for questions. I know that Carlos, we have a question from you, and before I go to Carlos, actually, Nina Bankova, are you with us still? I want to turn to Nina's question first, and then to Carlos. If we still have
Thank you, Carla.
Yes.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I asked my question just at the very beginning of the presentation, so I'm not even sure so much was said since then. But it made me think about the role of social media during the Arab Spring, and how is it different today with Ukraine? I mean, it's been a while now, and disinformation seems to be playing a larger role these days, and social media is kind of like, in many ways, that catalyst of it. So just any thoughts on that difference? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. First of all, the Arab Spring was one of the first great movements that was driven by social media, and the great crowds came as a result of it. And it taught people a lot about how to use it. It also taught autocratic governments a lot about how to repress it. And you're right, disinformation and suppression of the internet is now, automatic in a lot of these places. And it's expected when Russia goes into Kyiv, at a certain point, they'll turn off the internet in Kyiv so that people won't be able to connect. It's going to be hard for them to keep it off. But having said that, that the Arab Spring had some other kinds of lessons, a little bit like the lessons of Occupy Wall Street, which is social media is very good for mobilizing people. but you have to have a political goal. You have to have a concrete objective. Occupy Wall Street was like, yeah, we hate the 1%. And everybody, of course, hate the 1%. I mean, that makes perfect sense. But what are you going to do about it? What should we do now? Now we're here, we've got our guitars out, we're singing songs, we've got signs up, we've got a big protest going on. What do we do next? And so you have to have leaders who can translate the social movement into political action, whatever that political action is.
Thank you, David. And we also have in the chat, Jihad is mentioning the Tunisian revolution, sometimes which is referred to as the Facebook revolution. That's another fine example there. Let's go to Carlos, and after Carlos, Amelia, we'll take your question after Carlos. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Jakova. It's an amazing presentation. And it was good to also have another question come before me as well, Professor, because with the image of the Marseillaise in the back of my mind, I got teary. So it's very helpful, because my question is very bureaucratic and too pragmatic maybe, and I apologize in advance. Briefly, so my understanding, and please correct me, I come from the international community. I do not speak for the World Bank in any way, shape, or form. I'm on the engineering school side, so very far away from this. But there's this big conversation about kind of a wish list from the government colleagues on the federal government side of like some of the technologies of things on a very pragmatic perspective. On their end, I think I've read something on even the intelligence community thinking, well, we wanted a Uber kind of thing to do logistics because that would make us more efficient in some sense. I was wondering if the colleagues on the State Department side or kind of on the diplomatic side have these kinds of ways of thinking about this, or where should the research community be thinking about what is the wish list that could make a government more efficient, more effective. I generally do measurement and evaluation and so forth. Any kind of general advice on how to think about these things, because I think you very eloquently talked about the role of social media and social platforms, but it would be love to hear if you had any thinking or how we should be thinking about as researchers or technologists that are really worried about what's happening, and I'm sure wanted to contribute, but really do not wish to get exposed to any of these, we'll call it different worlds that are very far away from our own, but would love to engage. Thank you.
Well, I think, government communities, and I'll speak more about the US government communities, are kind of perverse as information systems, because most information systems are designed to serve the consumer of information. Government information systems, for example, the classified information system, is designed more to serve the creator of the information. And this is a product, by the way, of a hyper classified atmosphere. Billions of pieces of information in Washington are classified, in part because of perverse culture. In Washington, if something's not classified, it's not valuable. If something is open source, it's not valuable. And so you've got to classify it. Once you classify it, you start keeping it from people. And once you start keeping it from people, it stops being a useful piece of information, because it only goes for fewer and fewer people. And so the whole policy world in Washington is built with these perverse obstacles. So if I'm sitting in the State Department and I'm in Bureau X, and I want to know something because something that's happening in Bureau Y is tangentially relevant to me, guess what? I can't access that information. I don't have the clearance for that information. And so much of what's valuable is kept from the end users. Also, the end user is not the Secretary of State, right? The end user, there are 40,000 people in the State Department, but most of those people have no ability to query the creator of the information. And this is the national security side, but it's true throughout. We live in a world in which most of us are living in open source reality, where sharing and user-driven outcomes are the drivers, right? And you have the opposite here. And I think of course, it impoverishes governments in terms of the access of information that they need. I'll give you an example. I used to run a company that was an open source intelligence company. And I had this idea pre-Google, and the idea pre-Google was we would go out, search stuff, and be able, so if you're a government, and instantaneously, most of our clients, I thought they'd be companies, instantaneously, most of the clients were military and intelligence in the U.S. government, right? And so my big idea was, I thought, I can answer any question you've got. Well, first of all, I encountered one big problem here, okay? The big problem was it wasn't getting the answers that was the challenge, it was getting the right question. And the big problem in all intelligence systems is asking the right question. But the other problem that existed was people didn't trust open source information. And I once went into a briefing at a secret briefing room. It wasn't a secret briefing, so I can tell better, but it was a briefing in PACOM, which is the biggest military command in the world, in Hawaii. And there were several admirals there. And I had on the screen a picture of a North Korean missile launcher. And the guy came in and he said, take that down. He said, this is an unclassified briefing. You can't have that picture. And I said, well, it's on the internet. It's available to the public. He said, take it down anyway. So we get real problems in this system if people are refusing to even look at what's right there for everybody else to look at.
Thank you, David. And Carlos, thanks for the question. I want to take Amelia's question, and then we've got 4 other questions. David, after Amelia's question, would you feel comfortable if I just sort of do a sequence of questions and then give you a few minutes to expand or address any of those as possible? Would that be all right?
Whatever you like.
Great. Amelia, why don't we go with you, and then we'll take everyone else. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. My question would be if the music has charms to soothe the savage breast, do you think it would be a good idea to organize every now and then the conferences similar to the political ones, but considering the exchange or familiarization with the culture between the head of states? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if we're going to soothe those savage beasts, but I do think that creating cultural exchange helps. Some world leaders understand that. In fact, all world leaders have done it. Since the ancient societies, they would build big buildings to say, look at the quality of our culture. They would, when they conquered lands, they had everybody speak the same language. So they would, have the control of understanding what everybody else was saying. They would propagate their stories. They realized the power of their stories and use those to help organize societies, sometimes co-opting stories from one society to the other to help organize it. People use culture as a powerful tool, and even government leaders today will host big events and use those events to communicate something about their society, whether it's that they're open or that they're advanced or whatever. Carla and I were involved a bunch of years ago with trying to put together a summit where we brought together government officials and artists to talk about how they could work together. So we're big believers in that idea.
Thank you, Amelia. Thanks for the question. Let's, we're also getting some really fantastic questions and comments in the chat, and I want to encourage that to keep going as well. Burak, we'll go to you, Sydney, Raik, Stephanie, and Melissa. We'll just sort of go sequentially through your questions and then give David a chance to offer some closing thoughts. So Burak, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Rothkopf, for your deep insights. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but let me just wrap up into one question. I mean, according to the Freedom House report, which is published every year, democracy is in decline since the last 20, 30 years, and roughly 40% of the world is run by democracies. And so my question is, to what extent do you think the next generation young leaders could sustain a rules-based international order and could be included in policy making on major issues like education, economic inequality, peace and security, climate change, etc. Considering the fact that, especially in Africa, that 60% are under 30 years old, Afghanistan has a very young population, which is roughly 18 years old, 50% of the population. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Burak. There's a little bit of an echo, and I think we got your question, but if you have a moment to just put it in the chat also, just in case someone didn't hear it well, that would be great.
I got it.
And oh, thanks, David. And Sydney, let's hear from you.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for your time and for your great presentation. My question is this. Since George Floyd's death, particularly, arts organizations have continued to really upend due to inequitable practices. Staff artists and orchestras and opera companies and theater companies alike spoken out loudly against the exploitation of labor. Instagram accounts like Orchestra is Racist and Opera is Racist are just examples. Similarly, musicians and actors from the AFM Musicians Union to Screen Actors Guild have challenged studios to assess their contracts to assure equity as well. So with that said, in the spirit of cultivating authenticity, do you believe that the State Department, believe it or not, that the State Department should play any active role in brokering standard employment agreements for the private sector, or at least modeling them by paying standard wages to arts ambassadors? And either way, do you believe its activism or passivity on wage standards may compromise the integrity of U.S. diplomatic efforts?
Great question, Sydney. Thank you. Thanks for that. We'll go to Raik. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and then Stephanie, and then Melissa. Thanks.
Great. That's, of course, correct, Carla. Many thanks. I'd also like to take a moment and thank David for the insightful remarks. I have been sending emails with Carla in advance, considering the topic, how do I actually, if I want to get involved, how do I post a proposal to a US diplomatic post, wherever I may be at. Disclaimer, I'm in Leipzig. We have the fortune, we are fortunate as to have a US Consulate General in town. We also have a Russian Consulate General in town. And so my question goes in the following direction. If I have a proposal, and the proposal may include a decision structure that doesn't go up the ladder, down the ladder, but horizontal, so that, for example, you might get involved students who do Russian in university and students who do American studies in university. And yes, University of Leipzig has that. Is there any chance to get a horizontal, easy to maintain local decision structure? Can I get it approved? Maybe. And I'm already aware, and many thanks, Carla, for that great response. The first step would be a 2-page proposal. So this news going out there to anybody who might want to think about that 2-page proposal is the first step, and everything else comes next. But how is the decision structure if I hand in such a proposal? Does it always have to go up the ladder? Yeah.
I think we've got it right. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Stephanie, and then Melissa, please. And let's just try to keep it a little brief if we can, so that we give David a chance to offer his comments before we close. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David, for your remarks this morning. One quick question is, you talked a lot about listening, about empathy, the opportunities social media provides to build a movement and to engage with people. It seems to me that there's also, the more and more we do that, there's also less ability among people to actually engage with the other side and to have a dialogue and to discuss, because we only engage with what we already agree with. It's a trend that I see among my friends, And I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts on that are.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And Melissa?
Okay, thank you, David, very much for your human-focused angle into the unfolding events and crisis public diplomacy more generally. I have a question that is link up with the issue raised by Nina, and it's how can states prevent that citizens turn from partners into adversaries? We have seen it in many mass mobilizations. For instance, in the Black Lives Matter movement, Israel and Palestine back in May. I would be grateful if you could give me some insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. David, that's a lot to cover in 1 minute that we've got left. So, you know, any of that you feel you can address briefly, and I know you've got to run. So as much as you're able, and we're always happy to debrief. As I said, I'll be staying on the call a little extra afterwards as well. So thank you, David.
First question was on democracy is in decline, and how does the next generation maintain a rules-based international order? And I guess the answer is I tend to believe in progress. I tend to believe that the tools that exist right now are democratizing tools, such as the media that we're talking about. And I think ultimately they are transparency enhancing tools. And so I think the result is that it bodes well for democracy, but I have to say there will be people fighting against this because there are always small groups that would like to control it. And so, the emerging generation is going to have to do just as every other generation in the past has done, and that's fight for what they think is valuable. Should the State Department issue standard contracts? Yes, they should. Should they reach out to diverse groups and have a more representative set of groups of artists representing them in terms of cultural programs? Clearly, I think they should. Do you want a horizontal decision process in a State Department organization? Forget about it, not going to happen. Everything goes up the chain. That's just the way it is in a bureaucracy. If you've got a really good idea, don't go to the government. Go do it yourself. In terms of the issue of bubble mentality, this issue of people communicating with like-minded people, that seems to be a problem within the internet. But it's not that surprising. People like to find communities of like-minded folks and hang out in them. And one of the great things that the internet has been able to do thus far is it has been able to connect people who didn't have a like-minded community in their small world with others on the other side of the planet. So there's a benefit there. I think the key issue here is, critical thinking. We need to teach students in schools how to read differently. They need to learn how to use social media differently. They need to learn the benefits of getting a broader range of views than the same view over and over. And that means we need to push back on impulses like in the United States to, get rid of, to promote one version of history or one version of science. The internet can open up everything to everybody. We have to fight to ensure that it does. And, how do you stop movements in society from becoming adversarial to the government? The government's job is to listen to the movements. So if there's a big movement in a society, I think they need to engage with it. I'm a big believer in democracy, and that is the core of democracy. So I don't know if I answered your 5 questions in 60 seconds, but.
It was very impressive, David, as always. Let's please unmute and give David a big round of applause. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us.
Woo-hoo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone, I really want to express my thanks to David and welcome you back next week. We will have the former Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, with us. She's currently a professor at Sciences Po in Paris. A wealth of information specifically about preservation of heritage sites. I'm going to